Section 11 of A Little Tour in France by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. The weather the next day was equally fair, so that it seemed an imprudence not to make sure of Aigues Mortes. Nîmes itself could wait. At a pinch I could attend to Nîmes in the rain. It was my belief that Aigues Mortes was a little gem, and it is natural to desire that gems should have an opportunity to sparkle. This is an excursion of but a few hours, and there is a little friendly, familiar, dawdling train that will convey you, in time for a noonday breakfast, to the small, dead town where the blessed Saint Louis twice embarked for the Crusades. You may get back to Nîmes for dinner. The run, or rather the walk, for the train doesn't run, is of about an hour. I found the little journey charming, and looked out of the carriage window on my right at the distant Cevennes, covered with tones of amber and blue, and all around at vineyards red with the touch of October. The grapes were gone, but the plants had a colour of their own. Within a certain distance of Aigues Mortes they give place to wide salt marshes, traversed by two canals, and over this expanse the train rumbles slowly upon a narrow causeway, failing for some time, though you know you are near the object of your curiosity, to bring you to sight of anything but the horizon. Suddenly it appears, the towered and embattled mass, lying so low that the crest of its defences seems to rise straight out of the ground, and it is not till the train stops, close before them, that you are able to take the full measure of its walls. Aigues Mortes stands on the edge of a wide étang, or shallow inlet of the sea, the further side of which is divided by a narrow band of coast from the Gulf of Lyons. Next after Carcassonne, to which it forms an admirable pendant, it is the most perfect thing of its kind in France. It has a rival in the person of Avignon, but the ramparts of Avignon are much less effective. Like Carcassonne, it is completely surrounded with its old fortifications, and if they are far simpler in character, there is but one circle, they are quite as well preserved. The moat has been filled up, and the site of the town might be figured by a billiard table without pockets. On this absolute level, covered with coarse grass, Aigues Mortes presents quite the appearance of the walled town that a schoolboy draws upon his slate, or that we see in the background of early Flemish pictures, a simple parallelogram of a contour almost absurdly bare, broken at intervals by angular towers and square holes. Such, literally speaking, is this delightful little city, which needs to be seen to tell its full story. It is extraordinarily pictorial, and if it is a very small sister of Carcassonne, it has at least the essential features of the family. Indeed, it is even more like an image and less like a reality than Carcassonne, for by position and prospect it seems even more detached from the life of the present day. It is true that Aigues Mortes does a little business. It sees certain bags of salt piled into barges which stand in a canal beside it, and which carry their cargo into actual places. But nothing could well be more drowsy and desultory than this industry as I saw it practised, with the aid of 2 or 3 brown peasants, and under the eye of a solitary douanier who strolled on the little quay beneath the western wall. "C'est bien plaisant, c'est bien paisible," said this worthy man, with whom I had some conversation, and pleasant and peaceful is the place indeed, though the former of these epithets may suggest an element of gaiety in which Aigues Mortes is deficient. The sand, the salt, the dull sea view, surround it with a bright, quiet melancholy. There are 15 towers and 9 gates, 5 of which are on the southern side, overlooking the water. I walked all round the place 3 times, it doesn't take long, but lingered most under the southern wall, where the afternoon light slept in the dreamiest, sweetest way. I sat down on an old stone, and looked away at the desolate salt marshes and the still, shining surface of the étang, and as I did so reflected that this was a queer little out-of-the-world corner to have been chosen, in the great dominions of either monarch, for that pompous interview which took place in 1538 between Francis I and Charles V. It was also not easy to perceive how Louis IX, when in 1248 and 1270 he started for the Holy Land, set his army afloat in such very undeveloped channels. An hour later I purchased in the town a little pamphlet by M. Marius Topin, who undertakes to explain this latter anomaly, and to show that there is water enough in the port, as we may call it by courtesy, to have sustained a fleet of crusaders. I was unable to trace the channel that he points out, but was glad to believe that, as he contends, the sea has not retreated from the town since the 13th century. It was comfortable to think that things are not so changed as that. M. Topin indicates that the other French ports of the Mediterranean were not then disponibles, and that Aigues-Mortes was the most eligible spot for such an embarkation. Beneath the straight walls and the quiet gates, the little town has not crumbled like the Cité of Carcassonne. It can hardly be said to be alive, but if it is dead, it has been very neatly embalmed. The hand of the restorer rests on it constantly, but this artist has not, as at Carcassonne, had miracles to accomplish. The interior is very still and empty, with small, stony, whitewashed streets, tenanted by a stray dog, a stray cat, a stray old woman. In the middle is a little place, with 2 or 3 cafes decorated by wide awnings. A little place of which the principal feature is a very bad bronze statue of Saint Louis by Pradier. It is almost as bad as the breakfast I had at the inn that bears the name of that pious monarch. You may walk round the enceinte of Aigues-Mortes both outside and in, but you may not, as at Carcassonne, make a portion of this circuit on the Chemin de Ronde, the little projecting footway attached to the inner face of the battlements. This footway, wide enough only for a single pedestrian, is in the best order, and near each of the gates a flight of steps leads up to it, but a locked gate at the top of the steps makes access impossible, or at least unlawful. Aigues-Mortes, however, has its citadel, an immense tower, larger than any of the others, a little detached, and standing at the northwest angle of the town. I called upon the casernier, the custodian of the walls, and in his absence I was conducted through this big Tour de Constance by his wife, a very mild, meek woman, yellow with the traces of fever and ague, a scourge which, as might be expected in a town whose name denotes dead waters, enters freely at the 9 gates. The Tour de Constance is of extraordinary girth and solidity, divided into 3 superposed circular chambers with very fine vaults, which are lighted by embrasures of prodigious depth, converging to windows little larger than loopholes. The place served for years as a prison to many of the Protestants of the south, whom the revocation of the Edict of Nantes had exposed to atrocious penalties, and the annals of these dreadful chambers during the first half of the last century were written in tears and blood. Some of the recorded cases of long confinement there make one marvel afresh at what man has inflicted and endured. In a country in which a policy of extermination was to be put into practice, this horrible tower was an obvious resource. From the battlements at the top, which is surmounted by an old disused lighthouse, you see the little compact rectangular town, which looks hardly bigger than a garden patch, mapped out beneath you, and follow the plain configuration of its defences. You take possession of it, and you feel that you will remember it always. Chapter 28. After this I was free to look about me at Nimes, and I did so with such attention as the place appeared to require. At the risk of seeming too easily and too frequently disappointed, I will say that it required rather less than I had been prepared to give. It is a town of 3 or 4 fine features, rather than a town with, as I may say, a general figure. In general, Nimes is poor. Its only treasures are its Roman remains, which are of the first order. The new French fashions prevail in many of its streets. The old houses are paltry, and the good houses are new, while beside my hotel rose a big spick-and-span church, which had the oddest air of having been intended for Brooklyn or Cleveland. It is true that this church looked out on a square completely French, a square of fine modern disposition, flanked on one side by a classical Palais de Justice embellished with trees and parapets, and occupied in the centre with a group of allegorical statues, such as one encounters only in the cities of France, the chief of these being a colossal figure by Pradier representing Nimes. An English, an American town, which should have such a monument, such a square as this, would be a place of great pretensions. But like so many little villes de province in the country of which I write, Nimes is easily ornamental. What nobler ornament can there be than the Roman baths at the foot of Mont Cavalier, and the delightful old garden that surrounds them? All that quarter of Nimes has every reason to be proud of itself. It has been revealed to the world at large by copious photography. A clear, abundant stream gushes from the foot of a high hill, covered with trees and laid out in paths, and is distributed into basins which sufficiently refer themselves to the period that gave them birth, the period that has left its stamp on that pompous Pérou which we admired at Montpellier. Here are the same terraces and steps and balustrades, and a system of waterworks less impressive perhaps, but very ingenious and charming. The whole place is a mixture of old Rome and of the French 18th century, for the remains of the antique baths are, in a measure, incorporated in the modern fountains. In a corner of this umbrageous precinct stands a small Roman ruin, which was known as a temple of Diana, but was more apparently a nymphaeum, and appears to have had a graceful connection with the adjacent baths. I learned from Murray that this little temple, of the period of Augustus, was reduced to its present state of ruin in 1577. The moment at which the townspeople, threatened with a siege by the troops of the crown, partly demolished it, lest it should serve as a cover to the enemy. The remains are very fragmentary, but they serve to show that the place was lovely. I spent half an hour in it on a perfect Sunday morning. It is enclosed by a high grille, carefully tended, and has a warden of its own, and with the help of my imagination tried to reconstruct a little the aspect of things in the Gallo-Roman days. I do wrong, perhaps, to say that I tried. From a flight so deliberate I should have shrunk. But there was a certain contagion of antiquity in the air, and among the ruins of baths and temples, in the very spot where the aqueduct that crosses the Gardon in the wondrous manner I had seen discharged itself, the picture of a splendid paganism seemed vaguely to glow. Roman baths, those words alone were a scene. Everything was changed. I was strolling in a jardin français, the bosky slope of the Mont Cavalier, a very modest mountain, hanging over the place, is crowned with a shapeless tower, which is likely to be of mediaeval as of antique origin. And yet, as I leaned on the parapet of one of the fountains, where a flight of curved steps, a hemicycle, as the French say, descended into the basin full of dark, cool recesses, where the slabs of the Roman foundations gleam through the clear green water, as in this attitude I surrendered myself to contemplation and reverie, it seemed to me that I touched for a moment the ancient world. Such moments are illuminating, and the light of this one mingles in my memory with the dusky greenness of the Jardin de la Fontaine. The fountain proper, the source of all these distributed waters, is the prettiest thing in the world, a reduced copy of Vaucluse. It gushes up at the foot of the Mont Cavalier, at a point where that eminence rises with a certain cliff-like effect, and, like other springs in the same circumstances, appears to issue from the rock with a sort of quivering stillness. I trudged up the Mont Cavalier. It is a matter of 5 minutes, and having committed this cockneyism, enhanced it presently by another. I ascended the stupid Touraine, the mysterious structure I mentioned a moment ago. The only feature of this dateless tube, except the inevitable collection of photographs to which you are introduced by the doorkeeper, is the view you enjoy from its summit. This view is, of course, remarkably fine, but I am ashamed to say I have not the smallest recollection of it, for while I looked into the brilliant spaces of the air, I seemed still to see only what I saw in the depths of the Roman baths, the image, disastrously confused and vague, of a vanished world. This world, however, has left at Nimes a far more considerable memento than a few old stones covered with water moss. The Roman arena is the rival of those at Verona and Arles. At a respectful distance it emulates the Colosseum. It is a small Colosseum, if I may be allowed the expression, and is in a much better preservation than the great circus at Rome. This is especially true of the external walls, with their arches, pillars, cornices. I must add that one should not speak of preservation in regard to the arena at Nimes without speaking also of repair. After the great ruin ceased to be despoiled, it began to be protected, and most of its wounds have been dressed with new material. These matters concern the archaeologist, and I felt here, as I felt afterwards at Arles, that one of the profane, in the presence of such a monument, can only admire and hold his tongue. The great impression, on the whole, is an impression of wonder that so much should have survived. What remains at Nimes, after all dilapidation is estimated, is astounding. I spent an hour in the Arène on that same sweet Sunday morning, as I came back from the Roman baths, and saw that the corridors, the vaults, the staircases, the external casing are still virtually there. Many of these parts are wanting in the Colosseum, whose sublimity of size, however, can afford to dispense with detail. The seats at Nimes, like those at Verona, have been largely renewed. Not that this mattered much, as I lounged on the cool surface of one of them, and admired the mighty concavity of the place, and the elliptical skyline, broken by uneven blocks, and forming the rim of the monstrous cup, a cup that had been filled with horrors. And yet I made my reflections. I said to myself that though a Roman arena is one of the most impressive of the works of man, it has a touch of that same stupidity which I ventured to discover in the Pont du Gard. It is brutal, it is monotonous, it is not at all exquisite. The arènes at Nimes were arranged for a bullfight, a form of recreation that, as I was informed, is much dans les habitudes nimoises, and very common throughout Provence, where, still according to my information, it is the usual pastime of a Sunday afternoon. At Arles and Nimes it has a characteristic setting, but in the villages the patrons of the game make a circle of carts and barrels, on which the spectators perch themselves. I was surprised at the prevalence, in mild Provence, of the Iberian vice, and hardly know whether it makes the custom more respectable that at Nimes and Arles the thing is shabbily and imperfectly done. The bulls are rarely killed, and indeed often are bulls only in the Irish sense of the term, being domestic and motherly cows. Such an entertainment, of course, does not supply to the arena that element of the exquisite which I spoke of as wanting. The exquisite in Nimes is mainly represented by the famous Maison Carrée. The first impression you receive from this delicate little building as you stand before it is that you have seen it already many times. Photographs, engravings, models, medals have placed it definitely in your eye, so that from the sentiment with which you regard it, curiosity and surprise are almost completely, and perhaps deplorably, absent. Admiration remains, however, admiration of a familiar and even slightly patronizing kind. The Maison Carrée does not overwhelm you. You can conceive it. It is not one of the great sensations of the antique art, but it is perfectly felicitous, and in spite of having been put to all sorts of incongruous uses, marvellously preserved. Its slender columns, its delicate proportions, its charming compactness seem to bring one nearer to the century that built it than the great superpositions of arenas and bridges, and give it the interest that vibrates from one age to another when the note of taste is struck. If anything were needed to make this little toy temple a happy production, the service would be rendered by the second-rate boulevard that conducts to it, adorned with inferior cafes and tobacco shops. Here, in a respectable recess, surrounded by vulgar habitations, and with the theatre of a classic pretension opposite, stands the small square house, so called because it is much longer than it is broad. I saw it first in the evening, in the vague moonlight, which made it look as if it were cast in bronze. Stendhal says, justly, that it has the shape of a playing card, and he expresses his admiration for it by the singular wish that an exact copy of it should be erected in Paris. He even goes so far as to say that in the year 1880 this tribute will have been rendered to its charms. Nothing would be more simple to his mind than to have in that city le Panthéon de Rome, quelques temples de Grèce. Stendhal found it amusing to write in the character of a commis voyageur, and sometimes it occurs to his reader that he really was one. Chapter 29. On my way from Nimes to Arles, I spent 3 hours at Tarascon, chiefly for the love of Alphonse Daudet, who has written nothing more genial than Les Aventures Prodigieuses de Tartarin, and the story of the siege of the bright dead little town, a mythic siege by the Prussians, in the Contes du Lundi. In the introduction which, for the new edition of his works, he has lately supplied to Tartarin, the author of this extravagant but kindly satire gives some account of the displeasure with which he has been visited by the ticklish Tarasconnais. Daudet relates that in his attempt to shed a humorous light upon some of the more erratic phases of the Provençal character, he selected Tarascon at a venture, not because the temperament of its natives is more vainglorious than that of their neighbors, or their rebellion against the despotism of fact more marked, but simply because he had to name a particular Provençal city. Tartarin is a hunter of lions and a charmer of women, a true produit du Midi, as Daudet says, who has the most fantastic and fabulous adventures. He is a minimized Don Quixote, with much less dignity, but with equal good faith, and the story of his exploits is a little masterpiece of the light comical. The Tarasconnais, however, declined to take the joke, and opened the vials of their wrath upon the mocking child of Nimes, who would have been better employed, they doubtless thought, in showing up the infirmities of his own family. I am bound to add that when I passed through Tarascon, they did not appear to be in the least out of humour. Nothing could have been brighter, softer, more suggestive of amiable indifference than the picture it presented to my mind. It lies quietly beside the Rhone, looking across at Beaucaire, which seems very distant and independent, and tacitly consenting to let the castle of the good King René of Anjou, which projects very boldly into the river, pass for its most interesting feature. The other features are, primarily, a sort of vivid sleepiness in the aspect of the place, as if the September noon, it had lingered on into October, lasted longer there than elsewhere. Certain low arcades, which make the streets look grey and exhibit empty vistas, and a very curious and beautiful walk beside the Rhone denominated the Chaussée, a long and narrow causeway densely shaded by 2 rows of magnificent old trees, planted in its embankment, and rendered doubly effective, at the moment I passed over it, by a little train of collegians, who had been taken out for mild exercise by a pair of young priests. Lastly, one may say that a striking element of Tarascon, as of any town that lies on the Rhone, is simply the Rhone itself, the big brown flood of uncertain temper which has never taken time to forget that it is a child of the mountain and the glacier, and that such an origin carries with it great privileges. Later, at Avignon, I observed it in the exercise of these privileges, chief among which was that of frightening the good people of the old papal city half out of their wits. The chateau of King René serves today as the prison of a district, and the traveller who wishes to look into it must obtain his permission at the mairie of Tarascon. If he have had a certain experience of French manners, his application will be accompanied with the forms of a considerable obsequiosity, and in this case his request will be granted as civilly as it had been made. The castle has more of the air of a severely feudal fortress than I should suppose the period of its construction, the first half of the 15th century, would have warranted, being tremendously bare and perpendicular, and constructed for comfort only in the sense that it was arranged for defence. It is a square and simple mass, composed of small yellow stones, and perched on a pedestal of rock which easily commands the river. The building has the usual circular towers at the corners, and a heavy cornice at the top, and immense stretches of sun-scorched wall, relieved at wide intervals by small windows, heavily cross-barred. It has, above all, an extreme steepness of aspect. I cannot express it otherwise. The walls are as sheer and inhospitable as precipices. The castle has kept its large moat, which is now a hollow filled with wild plants. To this tall fortress the good René retired in the middle of the 15th century, finding it apparently the most substantial thing left him in a dominion which had included Naples and Sicily, Lorraine and Anjou. He had been a much-tried monarch and the sport of various fortune, fighting half his life for thrones he didn't care for, and exalted only to be quickly cast down. Provence was the country of his affection, and the memory of his troubles did not prevent him from holding a joyous court at Tarascon and at Aix. He finished the castle at Tarascon, which had been begun earlier in the century. Finished it, I suppose, for consistency's sake, in the manner in which it had originally been designed, rather than in accordance with the artistic tastes that formed the consolation of his old age. He was a painter, a writer, a dramatist, a modern dilettante, addicted to private theatricals. There is something very attractive in the image that he has imprinted on the page of history. He was both clever and kind, and many reverses and much suffering had not embittered him nor quenched his faculty of enjoyment. He was fond of his sweet Provence, and his sweet Provence has been grateful. It has woven a light tissue of legend around the memory of the good King René. I strolled over his dusky habitation. It must have taken all his good humour to light it up. At the heels of the custodian, who showed me the usual number of castle properties, a deep, well-like court, a collection of winding staircases and vaulted chambers, the embrasures of whose windows and the recesses of whose doorways reveal a tremendous thickness of wall. These things constitute the general identity of old castles, and when one has wandered through a good many, with due discretion of step and protrusion of head, one ceases very much to distinguish and remember, and contents oneself with consigning them to the honourable limbo of the romantic. I must add that this reflection did not the least deter me from crossing the bridge which connects Tarascon with Beaucaire, in order to examine the old fortress whose ruins adorn the latter city. It stands on a foundation of rock much higher than that of Tarascon, and looks over with a melancholy expression at its better conditioned brother. Its position is magnificent, and its outline very gallant. I was well rewarded for my pilgrimage, for if the castle of Beaucaire is only a fragment, the whole place, with its position and its views, is an ineffaceable picture. It was the stronghold of the Montmorencys, and its last tenant was that rash Duke François, whom Richelieu, seizing every occasion to trample on a great noble, caused to be beheaded at Toulouse, where we saw in the capital the butcher's knife with which the cardinal pruned the crown of France of its thorns. The castle, after the death of this victim, was virtually demolished. Its site, which nature today has taken again to herself, has an extraordinary charm. The mass of rock that it formerly covered rises high above the town, and is as precipitous as the side of the Rhone. A tall, rusty iron gate admits you from a quiet corner of Beaucaire to a wild, tangled garden covering the side of the hill, for the whole place forms the public promenade of the townsfolk, a garden without flowers, with little steep, rough paths that wind under a plantation of small, scrubby stone pines. Above this is the grassy platform of the castle, enclosed on one side only, toward the river, by a large fragment of wall and a very massive dungeon. There are benches placed in the lee of the wall, and others on the edge of the platform, where one may enjoy a view, beyond the river, of certain peeled and scorched undulations. A sweet desolation, an everlasting peace, seem to hang in the air. A very old man, a fragment like the castle itself, emerged from some crumbling corner to do me the honours. A very gentle, obsequious, tottering, toothless, grateful old man. He beguiled me into an ascent of the solitary tower, from which you may look down on the big sallow river and glance at diminished Tarascon, and the bare-faced, bald-headed hills behind it. It may appear that I insist too much upon the nudity of the Provençal horizon, too much considering that I have spoken of the prospect from the heights of Beaucaire as lovely. But it is an exquisite bareness. It seems to exist for the purpose of allowing one to follow the delicate lines of the hills and touch with the eyes, as it were, the smallest inflections of the landscape. It makes the whole thing seem wonderfully bright and pure. Beaucaire used to be the scene of a famous fair, the great fair of the south of France. It has gone the way of most fairs, even in France, where these delightful exhibitions hold their own much better than might be supposed. It is still held in the month of July, but the bourgeoises of Tarascon send to the Magasin du Louvre for their smart dresses, and the principal glory of the scene is its long tradition. Even now, however, it ought to be the prettiest of all fairs, for it takes place in a charming wood which lies just beneath the castle, beside the Rhone. The booths, the barracks, the platforms of the mountebanks, the bright-coloured crowd, diffused through this midsummer shade, and spotted here and there with the rich Provençal sunshine, must be of the most pictorial effect. It is highly probable, too, that it offers a large collection of pretty faces, for even in the few hours that I spent at Tarascon, I discovered symptoms of the purity of feature for which the women of the Pays d'Arles are renowned. The Arlesian headdress was visible in the streets, and this delightful coiffure is so associated with a charming facial oval, a dark mild eye, a straight Greek nose, and a mouth worthy of all the rest, that it conveys a presumption of beauty which gives the wearer time either to escape or to please you. I have read somewhere, however, that Tarascon is supposed to produce handsome men, as Arles is known to deal in handsome women. It may be that I should have found the Tarasconnais very fine fellows if I had encountered enough specimens to justify an induction, but there were very few males in the streets, and the place presented no appearance of activity. Here and there the black coif of an old woman or of a young girl was framed by a low doorway, but for the rest, as I have said, Tarascon was mostly involved in a siesta. There was not a creature in the little church of St. Martha, which I made a point of visiting before I returned to the station, and which, with its fine Romanesque side portal and its pointed and crocketed Gothic spire, is as curious as it need be in view of its tradition. It stands in a quiet corner where the grass grows between the small cobblestones, and you pass beneath a deep archway to reach it. The tradition relates that St. Martha tamed with her own hands and attached to her girdle a dreadful dragon, who was known as the Tarasque, and is reported to have given his name to the city on whose site, amid the rocks which form the base of the chateau, he had his cavern. The dragon, perhaps, is the symbol of a ravening paganism dispelled by the eloquence of a sweet evangelist. The bones of the interesting saint, at all events, were found in the 11th century in a cave beneath the spot on which her altar now stands. I know not what had become of the bones of the dragon. End of section 11.